Welcome back to BioB 160 Principles of Living Systems. I'm Ruth Reitzman, your instructor for the course, and in this episode we'll examine the topic of evolution and descent with modification. The name Charles Darwin is recognized by most people, and most everyone has heard something about the theory of evolution. However, not everyone knows about Charles Darwin as a person or about the actual scientific meaning of the term evolution. The goal of this episode is to give you some background on Charles Darwin and how his observations led to our current understanding of biological evolution. Charles Darwin was born in 1809 in England, and he grew up loving the out-of-doors. He loved to hunt and fish. He collected beetles and studied all types of biological specimens. Charles' father was very concerned that his son would never find a proper gentleman's vocation. Charles and his brother were sent to Edinburgh to study medicine. However, after Charles observed one surgery, and since this was the early 1800s, it was a surgery performed without anesthesia, he left the operating room and vowed never to return to medical school. His father then decided that perhaps Charles was better suited for the clergy and sent him to theological school. Charles fared better in his theological studies, especially since this left him lots of time to pursue other interests: beetle collecting, botanical studies, and reading all types of books about biology and geology. When he finished his studies, he was invited to be the naturalist for a round-the-world voyage of the HMS Beagle. Charles' father reluctantly allowed him to go on the voyage, thinking that when he returned to England he would settle down as a village clergyman. Charles spent 5 years on this voyage collecting plants and animals from all over the world. He visited South America, the Galapagos Islands, and Australia. And when he returned to England, he was celebrated by the scientific community as a first-class explorer and naturalist. He did settle down and marry, but he never served as a clergyman. Instead, he spent the next 20 years studying and writing and developing an amazing synthesis of ideas that he published in 1859 entitled The Origin of Species. The HMS Beagle was a sailing ship, and Charles spent the 5-year voyage in cramped quarters, being extremely seasick. However, he did manage to read and write during the voyage and spent considerable time on land, particularly in South America. During the land portions of this trip, he collected specimens, made sketches of his specimens, and cataloged as much of the natural flora and fauna as possible. He was particularly entranced with the Galapagos Islands, a series of islands off the coast of Ecuador. On the Galapagos Islands, Charles noted the differences in animals found on the different islands. The giant tortoises on some of the islands had very short necks, while other islands there were tortoises with very long necks. He also observed many different birds and found that similar birds on different islands had varied beak sizes. And interestingly, the beak sizes and shape corresponded to the type of food available for the birds. For example, several islands had populations of birds that ate nectar from cactus flowers. These birds had relatively long beaks so that they could scoop the nectar out of the flowers. Some islands were populated with insects and birds with long, thin beaks that enabled them to snatch insects from leaves. And on other islands there were plants with tough seeds, and birds had heavy seed-crunching beaks. The birds seemed to fit their environment. On returning home to England, Darwin reviewed his notes and collection of plants and animals. He also thought about the environment of England and of the animals and plants on his farm and in the countryside. Darwin began to think about the origins of all the different living things on the planet, and he developed his ideas on the origin of species. His main ideas aimed at explaining the sources of life's unity and diversity. In other words, living things share many properties, and they have unique distinctive properties as well. He used the phrase descent with modification to explain this unity and diversity. He also proposed that the source of this unity and diversity was natural selection, which led to the adaptation of organisms to their environment. Darwin turned to comic examples to explain how selection works. In the development of crop plants, for instance, certain traits are desired, and so plants or animals with the desired traits are selected and bred. Over time, a plant breeder will develop strains of plants with desired characteristics. In other words, the true breeding strains that Mendel studied in his pea plants. An example of artificial selection of crops is shown here. The wild mustard is the parent plant for a number of important food crops, including kale, Brussels sprouts, cabbage, broccoli, and kohlrabi. None of the crop plants look exactly like the wild mustard, but they all share similarities in their modes of reproduction and similarities in their taste. Another familiar example of species change is the wolf-to-dog transition. All domestic dog breeds are in the Canis familiaris genus and species, and are descendants of the wolf Canis lupus. Today's dog breeds are quite different from wolves, but they share similarities in body appearance. Darwin's theory of natural selection and adaptation are based on two observations. The first observation was that members of any population of an organism will vary in their inherited traits. The second observation was that all species can produce more offspring than the environment can support, and many of these offspring fail to survive and reproduce. This figure shows an example of variations that exist in a population of beetles. Notice that some of the beetles have larger spots and some have smaller spots. Some of the beetles are slightly darker orange and some are lighter orange. If the beetle is the prey species for a predator, such as a bird, some of the beetle variants may be more obvious to the predator and may be more likely to be eaten. If a particular variant of the beetle can blend into the background, it will be more likely to survive and reproduce. The progeny of these beetles will have the same characteristics as the parent and will blend into the background and avoid predation. In this figure, we can see the enormous cloud of reproductive spores produced by a puffball fungus. Of the billions of spores that are produced by each fungus, only a few of the spores will land in an area that's suitable for reproduction. Perhaps the lightest spores that can travel the farthest on air currents will be able to land in an area that supports its growth. The progeny spores of the light spores will then likely to be light as well, and so over time the selection is for the lightest weight spores. From Darwin's two observations, the observation of variance in individuals within a population and the observation that individuals produce many offspring and that not all survive, there are two inferences from these observations. The first inference is that individuals whose inherited traits give them a higher probability of surviving and reproducing in a given environment tend to leave more offspring than other individuals. The second inference is that the unequal ability of individuals to survive and reproduce will lead to the accumulation of favorable traits in a population over generations. To summarize, natural selection is a process in which individuals that have certain heritable traits survive and reproduce at a higher rate than other individuals. And over time, natural selection can increase the match between organisms and their environment. Or we could also say that over time, organisms are fitted to their environment. This photo shows an example of insect camouflage as an example of evolutionary adaptation. If you look very carefully, you can see the insect, the flower mantid, sitting on the orchid, a great example of protective camouflage. Another implication of the natural selection is that if the environment changes, or if individuals move to a new environment, natural selection may result in adaptations to these new conditions, sometimes giving rise to new species. Of course, it's also possible that the move to the new environment is not favorable for the species, and if it fails to survive and reproduce, it will become extinct. There are a few things to note about natural selection and adaptation. Note that individuals do not evolve, rather populations of organisms evolve over time. Also note that natural selection can only increase or decrease heritable traits that vary in a population. So if all organisms are the same for a given trait, for instance having black fur, then no natural selection can occur. And it also should be noted that adaptations vary with different environments. So a trait that's beneficial in one environment, such as having a heavy coat of fur in a cold environment, might be detrimental in a different environment. The heavy coat that might not be helpful in a warm tropical environment. In part 2 of this episode, we'll continue our exploration of evolution and look at what we've learned in 150 years since Darwin published his Origin of Species.